At my son's wedding dinner, my husband of 32 years stood up, looked me dead in the eye, and announced, "Helen, this is the end for us. I've found someone new." His secretary Jessica sat directly across from me at our family table, wearing a smug smile like she'd just won the lottery. The entire reception hall went silent. Every fork stopped midair. Every conversation died. My own family stared at me like I was a wounded animal they didn't know how to help. But instead of breaking down, instead of screaming or throwing my wine in his face like everyone expected, I leaned forward, looked Thomas straight in the eye, and said with the calmest voice I could muster, "Well, thank you for the heads up." Then I reached into my purse, pulled out a manila envelope I'd been carrying for weeks, and slid it across the white tablecloth toward him. "Here's a little something for you to read later." Before he could even touch that envelope, I stood up, smoothed down my navy blue dress, the one I'd bought specifically for this beautiful day, kissed my son Michael on the forehead, and walked out of that reception hall with my head held high. Behind me, I heard Thomas tearing open the envelope. Then came the sound that still gives me chills to this day. A scream so loud, so full of rage and panic that it echoed through the entire banquet hall of Riverside Manor. But how did we get here? How does a woman who spent 32 years building a life with a man end up orchestrating his downfall at their son's wedding? The question isn't, how could I do something so calculated, so devastating? The real question is, how does a woman like me, who dedicated her entire life to her family, come to the decision to methodically plan the destruction of the man she once loved? I wasn't always the kind of woman who would carry divorce papers in her purse, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. There was a time when I believed in love and partnership in the promises we made to each other. The year was 1991, and I was 26 years old running a small catering business out of my apartment kitchen. Helen's Delights, I called it. Soul food with a gourmet twist. My grandmother's mac and cheese recipe elevated with aged cheddar and truffle oil. Cornbread that people drove across town for. Peach cobbler that made grown men weep. I had 12 regular clients and dreams of opening my own restaurant someday. The future stretched before me, full of possibility. Thomas was this charming insurance adjuster who hired me to cater his office Christmas party. 6'2" with shoulders that filled out his suit jacket perfectly. When he smiled, a small dimple appeared in his right cheek like a secret meant only for me. He swept me off my feet with talk about building a life together, having children, creating something beautiful. The night he proposed, we sat on the rooftop of my apartment building. I'd spread out a blanket, brought up a bottle of wine, some cheese, and my special raspberry tarts. The city lights sparkled around us like earthbound stars. "I've never met anyone like you, Helen," he said, taking my hand in his. "You pour your heart into everything you do. The way you talk about food, about flavors and textures, it's like poetry." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. "I want to build something amazing with you. Will you marry me?" The ring wasn't large or flashy, but it was perfect. A single diamond set in white gold, elegant and timeless, just like I hoped our love would be. 6 months later, we were married in a small ceremony with just our closest friends and family. I remember the way Thomas looked at me as I walked down the aisle like I was the most precious thing he'd ever seen. How could I have known that 20 years later he would look at his secretary the same way? It wasn't until after we were engaged that Thomas mentioned his first marriage. He'd been married briefly in his early 20s. His first wife had cheated on him, then taken him for everything in the divorce. "She blindsided me," Thomas said, his voice tight with old pain. "One minute we were happy, the next, she was sleeping with her boss and demanding half of everything. That should have been my first warning sign. The bitterness in his voice when he spoke about her, the way he seemed more upset about the financial loss than the betrayal itself. But when you're in love, you don't see red flags. You see challenges to overcome together. "I'm not going through that financial nightmare again," he told me one evening a month before our wedding. "I've had my attorney draw up a prenuptial agreement. It protects both of us, Helen. It's just smart planning." I signed it without really reading it, trusting him completely, believing that our love would last forever and those legal documents would never matter. Young love makes you do foolish things like sign contracts you don't understand. That prenuptial agreement would stay buried in our files for 32 years until the moment I needed it most. The first sacrifice came during our engagement. Thomas's company offered him a promotion that required us to move 3 hours away to a bigger city. "It's temporary," he assured me, his hands cupping my face the way they used to when he wanted me to trust him completely. Just a few years to get established, then we'll move back and you can restart your business. I believed him because I loved him. I sold my catering equipment, said goodbye to my clients, and followed him to a city where I knew nobody. We bought a small starter home in a neighborhood on the rise. The kitchen was half the size of the one in my old apartment, but Thomas promised we'd renovate soon. We never did. The restaurant dream got packed away in boxes along with my grandmother's cast iron skillets. I told myself it was just a pause, not an end, that the sacrifice was worth it because we were building a future together. I didn't realize then that it would be the first of many dreams I'd set aside for Thomas's career. As I unpacked our dishes in that small kitchen, arranging them in cabinets that wouldn't be replaced for 2 decades, I felt a pang of loss that I quickly suppressed. This is what marriage is, I told myself. Compromise, support. This is what love looks like. The second sacrifice came when Michael was born 2 years later. Suddenly, Thomas's career became even more important because we had a family to think about. He worked longer hours while I stayed home with our beautiful baby boy, pouring all my love and creativity into being the perfect mother. Michael had Thomas's dimple and my determination. From the moment he could stand, he wanted to explore everything, touch everything, understand how the world worked. I channeled my passion for cooking into making homemade baby food pureeing, organic vegetables, testing different spice combinations that would expand his palate from an early age. I told myself I'd restart the catering business when Michael started school. But when he turned 5, Thomas's company restructured. He took a pay cut and suddenly my hobby wasn't practical anymore. "We need stability, Helen," he'd say, whenever I brought up my business dreams. "Michael needs his college fund. We need the house payment covered. Maybe when things settle down." Things never settled down. There was always another reason, another excuse, another financial goal that took priority over my dreams. So I got a job at First National Credit Union, where my attention to detail and people skills made me indispensable. I became the person everyone trusted with their most sensitive financial information. I processed loans, managed accounts, and learned every trick in the book about tracking money and uncovering financial secrets. Those skills would later save my life, but at the time they just made me the reliable one, the responsible one, the one who kept everything running smoothly. The years passed in a blur of school drop-offs, dinner preparations, birthday parties, and quiet compromises. I watched Michael grow from an energetic boy into a thoughtful young man. He graduated high school as valedictorian, got into college on a full scholarship, and made us proud in ways we never imagined. Through it all, Thomas and I settled into the comfortable rhythm of a long marriage. Not passionate, perhaps, but stable, predictable. For 32 years, I supported every single one of Thomas's career moves. When he wanted to switch companies, I helped him polish his resume. When he needed to impress potential clients, I planned dinner parties that made him look good. When he decided to start his own insurance firm 10 years ago, I co-signed the business loan with my pristine credit and worked overtime at the credit union to cover our personal expenses while his business got off the ground. I never complained, not really. I told myself that this was what good wives did. They supported their husbands. They put family first. They waited for their turn. I convinced myself that Thomas appreciated my sacrifices, that he saw how much I gave up for him and Michael, that someday it would be my turn to pursue my passion. When Michael graduated college with honors, I felt proud that my sacrifices had contributed to raising such an amazing young man. When he got his first job at a prestigious firm, I told myself all those years of putting his needs first had been worth it. When Thomas's business finally became profitable enough that we could afford luxuries again, I thought maybe finally it was my turn. I was 55 years old when I first brought up restarting my catering business. Now that Michael's graduated college and your business is stable, I said over dinner one night, "I've been thinking about getting back into cooking professionally." Thomas barely looked up from his phone. "That's nice, honey," he said. "But don't you think you're a little old to be starting over? Besides, Jessica and I have been talking about expanding the office. We might need your help with the books." Jessica. Even then, her name was coming up more and more in our conversations. His indispensable secretary who was so organized and really understood the business. I should have paid more attention to how his voice changed when he talked about her, but I was too busy being grateful that he finally trusted me enough to help with his company's finances. I spent the next 2 years doing unpaid bookkeeping for Thomas's business, watching him build something successful while my own dreams gathered dust. I told myself I was being supportive, that marriage was about teamwork, that my time would come eventually. But what I didn't know was that while I was balancing his books and keeping his business profitable, Jessica was balancing something else entirely. And Thomas had already decided that his future didn't include the woman who'd sacrificed 32 years of her life to build his. The first red flag appeared 6 months before Michael's wedding, hidden in plain sight, like a wolf in sheep's clothing. I was organizing our home office, preparing tax documents for our accountant, when I found a credit card statement that didn't belong in our usual stack of bills. Chase Sapphire Reserve Premium Card, $15,000 credit limit, account holder Thomas Johnson. My hands trembled as I opened it. Charges for restaurants I'd never been to, jewelry stores I'd never heard of, weekend trips to hotels and cities Thomas had never mentioned visiting for business. The statement showed a balance of $8,000, money that wasn't coming from our joint checking account. When I confronted him that evening, Thomas barely looked up from his laptop. "Business expenses, honey," he said with that dismissive tone he'd perfected over the years. "Client entertainment networking events. Jessica handles all the paperwork for reimbursements." Jessica again. Always Jessica these days. But why a separate card? I pressed my voice steadier than I felt. "Why not use our business account?" "Tax purposes," he replied smoothly. "Our accountant suggested it. Don't worry about it, Helen. You handle the home finances. I handle the business stuff." That should have been the end of it. The old me would have accepted his explanation and gone back to trusting blindly. But 30 years at the credit union had taught me that financial secrets always tell the truth. And this statement was screaming lies. So I started paying attention, really paying attention. I noticed how Thomas's phone was always face down now, how he'd step outside to take certain calls, how he developed a sudden interest in working late on Fridays and weekends. I watched him shower longer-use cologne on random Tuesday mornings and spend 20 minutes styling his hair for client meetings. A strange calm settled over me as I began to see the truth. It wasn't panicked or frantic. It was cold and clear like lake water in winter. For the first time in decades, I started thinking about my own protection instead of his comfort. The second discovery came 3 weeks later when I was dropping off lunch at his office. A surprise visit with his favorite sandwich from the deli down the street. Jessica wasn't at her desk, and I could hear laughter coming from Thomas's office. Female laughter, intimate laughter. I stood in that reception area for 5 minutes, listening to my husband's voice mixing with hers in a way that made my stomach turn inside out. They weren't discussing insurance policies. When they finally emerged from his office, Jessica's lipstick was smudged and Thomas's tie was crooked. They both froze when they saw me standing there holding his sandwich like some pathetic wife playing delivery service. "Helen," Thomas's voice was too bright, too surprised. "What brings you here?" "Brought your lunch." I managed setting the bag on Jessica's desk. "Thought you might be hungry." Jessica smoothed her skirt and smiled at me with pure venom disguised as sweetness. "That's so thoughtful," she purred. "Thomas is lucky to have someone who takes such good care of him." The way she said "takes care of him" made it clear she thought my job was menial, temporary, easily replaceable. But what really struck me was the tie Thomas was wearing. It was the blue silk one I'd given him for his birthday last year, the one he'd said was a little too flashy for his taste. Apparently it wasn't too flashy for Jessica. I smiled back and left without another word, but inside something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't just suspicious anymore. I wasn't just hurt. I was angry. And beneath that anger was something even more powerful: resolve. Have you ever reached a point where you suddenly see your entire life with perfect clarity, where all the little compromises and sacrifices you've made over the years suddenly align into a pattern so clear it takes your breath away? That's what happened to me in that moment, standing in the elevator of my husband's office building, watching the numbers count down to the lobby. I started documenting everything. Every late night, every unexplained absence, every time he claimed to be working but his office lights were off when I drove by. I used my lunch breaks to follow him sometimes, and what I saw confirmed my worst fears. Thomas and Jessica holding hands in restaurant booths across town, kissing in his car in empty parking lots, shopping together at jewelry stores where he'd never taken me, not even for our anniversary. But I didn't confront him. Not yet. I needed more than suspicions. I needed proof that would stand up in court. The hardest part wasn't gathering evidence or planning my strategy. It was pretending to be the same naive, trusting wife Thomas expected me to be. For months, I had to perform the role of my life. Every morning, I made Thomas's coffee exactly the way he liked it, kissed him goodbye, and wished him well at work. Every evening, I asked about his day and listened to his lies about late meetings and difficult clients. When he claimed he'd be working weekends, I packed him lunch and told him not to work too hard. The performance required every ounce of self-control I possessed. When he came home smelling like Jessica's perfume, I bit my tongue and said nothing. When he forgot our anniversary for the first time in 32 years, I pretended it didn't matter. When he started working out obsessively and buying new clothes, I complimented his dedication to staying healthy. Through it all, Rachel Martinez became my lifeline. Rachel had been my college roommate, the smartest woman I knew, who'd gone on to become a family law attorney specializing in high-asset divorces. We'd stayed in touch over the years, meeting for lunch, whenever her schedule allowed sharing stories about our kids and our marriages. Helen, Rachel's voice was surprised when I called her out of the blue one afternoon. "This is unexpected. How are you doing?" "I need legal advice," I said without preamble, "and I need absolute confidentiality." The silence stretched for several seconds. Rachel was sharp enough to understand that this wasn't a casual call about updating our wills. "Come to my office tomorrow," she said finally. "Bring whatever documents you have." I didn't tell Thomas where I was going the next day. I simply said I had errands to run, and he didn't ask for details. He rarely did anymore. Rachel's office was in a sleek downtown building 30 floors up with a view of the city skyline. As I sat across from her, watching her face change as she looked through the credit card statements and photographs I'd collected, I felt a strange sense of calm. "He's been seeing her for at least 6 months," I explained, my voice steady. "Maybe longer. I'm not sure yet." Rachel nodded, her expression professional, but her eyes sympathetic. "And you want to file for divorce?" It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "Yes, but not yet. There's something else I need to show you." The worst discovery was yet to come, and I'd made it just 2 days earlier. 2 months before Michael's wedding, I was balancing our joint checking account when I noticed irregular transfers. Small amounts. 500 here, 800 there, moving out of our savings into an account I didn't recognize. The reference numbers led me down a rabbit hole that made my blood run cold. Using my access at the credit union, I traced those transfers to a secret account Thomas had opened 18 months earlier. An account with both his name and Jessica's name on it. An account that contained over $40,000 of our money. Money he'd been systematically stealing from our retirement savings to fund his affair. I spread the bank statements across Rachel's desk, my finger tracing the pattern of withdrawals. He's been taking money from our retirement account for over a year, buying jewelry for her weekend getaways, even putting a down payment on an apartment in her name. Rachel studied the documents, her brow furrowed. "This is serious, Helen. This isn't just an affair. This is financial fraud." "I know," I said quietly, "and there's more." I pulled the prenuptial agreement from my bag, the pages yellowed with age. Thomas insisted on this before we got married. I never read it carefully. I just signed it because I trusted him. Rachel took the document, flipping through the pages with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen hundreds of similar contracts. When she reached page 23, her eyebrows shot up and a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Helen," she said, setting the papers down and leaning back in her chair, "do you understand what you have here?" I shook my head. "A prenup that protects his assets." "Much more than that," Rachel said, flipping to page 23 and pointing to a specific clause. "This is a fidelity provision. Thomas insisted on including language that voids most of the asset protection if either party commits adultery during the marriage." My heart stopped completely. "What does that mean?" "It means," Rachel continued, her voice growing more excited, "that if you can prove Thomas has been unfaithful, this prenuptial agreement becomes worthless. All those protections he put in place to safeguard his business and investments, they disappear the moment he violated his marriage vows." The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. Thomas's paranoia about his first wife's betrayal had led him to create a legal trap for his own infidelity. "How much proof do I need?" I asked, thinking about the manila folder full of evidence sitting between us. Rachel smiled like a shark sensing blood in the water. "Bank records showing he used marital assets to fund an affair would be excellent. Photos of them together would be helpful. Any evidence of cohabitation or joint financial accounts would be devastating." I had all of that and more. "There's something else," Rachel said, flipping through more pages. Because you co-signed the business loan and worked unpaid for his company, you're entitled to compensation for your contributions. Combined with the adultery clause, you're looking at keeping the house, most of the investments, and potentially alimony. For the first time in months, I felt genuine hope spreading through my chest. But then a thought occurred to me. What about Michael's wedding? It's in 2 months. I don't want this to overshadow his big day. Rachel nodded thoughtfully. We can file the papers, but delay serving them until after the wedding. The important thing is to file first. Don't give Thomas time to hide assets or prepare a defense. Strike quickly and decisively. That afternoon, I began preparing for war. I organized every piece of evidence, documented every stolen dollar, and started planning the most important performance of my life. I'd thought Thomas wanted to humiliate me at our son's wedding. I thought he'd invited Jessica to flaunt their affair in front of our family and friends. But 3 days before the wedding, I realized his plan was even more calculated than I'd imagined. "Helen," he said over dinner, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd learned to hate. "I need to tell you something about the reception." I looked up from my plate, channeling every ounce of innocent curiosity I could muster. "What about it?" "I've invited Jessica," he said, watching my face carefully. "She's been such a huge help with the business, and I thought it would be nice to include her in the celebration." The audacity took my breath away. He was bringing his mistress to our son's wedding, setting the stage for maximum cruelty, and he wanted my permission first. The old Helen would have questioned it, maybe even objected. But the new Helen, the one who'd been planning her revenge for weeks, simply smiled. "Of course," I said. "That's very thoughtful. She's been working so hard." Thomas's face showed a flicker of surprise, as if he'd expected more resistance. But then his expression settled into smug satisfaction. He thought he'd broken me down so completely that I wouldn't even fight for my own dignity. "Good," he said. "I knew you'd understand." That night, I finalized every detail of my plan. The envelope was prepared, the legal papers filed and ready, the evidence organized and documented. I even practiced my response in the mirror, perfecting the calm, graceful demeanor that would throw everyone off balance. Because I'd realized something crucial about revenge. The sweetest kind comes not from losing your temper, but from maintaining perfect control while your enemy destroys himself. The morning of Michael's wedding, I woke up feeling something I hadn't experienced in months. Genuine peace. I put on my navy blue dress, the one that made me feel confident and powerful, and did my makeup with extra care. Today wasn't just my son's wedding day. It was the day I reclaimed my life. Thomas was unusually cheerful as we got ready, humming while he shaved, taking extra time with his appearance. He thought today was his victory lap, the day he'd finally rid himself of the boring wife who'd served her purpose and could now be discarded for a newer model. At the reception, I watched him whisper something to Jessica that made her laugh, probably discussing how easy this was going to be, how I'd never see it coming. I smiled and waved at them across the room, playing my part until the very last moment. When Thomas stood up to make his announcement, when he looked at me with that mixture of pity and cruelty in his eyes, when he delivered his rehearsed speech about our marriage being over, I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. He thought he was about to destroy me. Instead, he just walked directly into the trap I'd spent weeks preparing. Every word he spoke, every cruel revelation, every moment of public humiliation he inflicted on me in front of our family only made the contents of that envelope more devastating. Because while Thomas had been planning a public execution, I'd been preparing a resurrection that would leave him screaming. I was halfway to the parking lot when I heard the sound, a roar of pure rage and panic that cut through the evening air like a wounded animal. Through the reception hall's windows, I could see Thomas standing at our table, the manila envelope torn open in his hands, papers scattered across the white tablecloth like fallen leaves. His face had drained of every drop of color. The confident, smug expression he'd worn during his announcement was gone, replaced by something I'd never seen before. Genuine terror. His hands shook as he rifled through the documents, his eyes scanning the legal papers with growing horror. Jessica leaned forward, trying to read over his shoulder, her perfectly manicured fingers reaching for the divorce papers. "Thomas, what is this?" she asked, her voice cutting through the stunned silence of the reception hall. But Thomas couldn't speak. He was staring at the bank statements I'd included, the ones showing every penny he'd stolen from our joint accounts, every dollar he'd transferred to their secret account, every purchase he'd made for her, with money that belonged to both of us. "Thomas, Jessica's voice was sharper now, more demanding. She grabbed one of the papers from his trembling hands and began to read. I watched through this window as her expression changed from confusion to disbelief to cold, calculating panic. She was reading the adultery clause in our prenuptial agreement, the clause that voided all of Thomas's financial protections the moment he committed adultery. The clause that meant everything he thought he'd safeguarded for their future together was now mine to claim. "This cannot be real," Jessica said, her voice loud enough that the nearest tables could hear every word. "You said she would never fight back. You said she was too weak, too dependent." Too weak, too dependent. The words confirmed everything I'd suspected about their conversations. They'd sat in that secret apartment I'd helped pay for, mocking me, planning my humiliation, convinced that I was too broken down to defend myself. Thomas finally found his voice, but it came out as a strangled whisper that gradually built to a shout. "She knew," he said. "She knew everything. She's been planning this." The family members at nearby tables were starting to understand that something terrible was happening. Michael stood up from the head table, his face confused and concerned. "Dad, what's going on?" But Thomas was beyond caring about appearances now. He held up the divorce papers, his voice cracking with desperation. "She filed for divorce this morning. She's claiming adultery. She's trying to take everything." "Take everything?" Jessica's voice was rising to match his. "What do you mean, take everything? You said the prenup protected your assets." "The prenup is void." Thomas screamed loud enough that the entire reception hall fell silent again. "The adultery clause voids the whole thing. She gets the house, the investments, everything." I watched Jessica's face cycle through a series of emotions: shock, anger, and then something that looked disturbingly like calculation. She wasn't devastated that their affair had been exposed. She was furious that the money was gone. "You told me she was just filing taxes," Jessica hissed. "You said she was too stupid to understand finances. You said she'd never figure out the account." The account. Their secret account. She was talking about it right there in front of everyone, confirming every suspicion our family had ever had about their relationship. Michael was on his feet now, his new wife Sarah beside him, both of them staring at Thomas with growing horror. My sister Margaret had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Sarah's parents looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor, but Thomas and Jessica were too caught up in their panic to care about the audience they'd created. They were turning on each other like cornered animals, each trying to blame the other for their predicament. "You said you had everything under control," Jessica shouted. "You said she was broken, that she'd never fight back." "I thought she was," Thomas shot back. "She never questioned anything. She never even looked at the statements." "Well, clearly she looked." Jessica's voice was pure venom now. "And now what? Now we have nothing. The apartment lease is in my name. The credit cards are maxed out. You said you were going to take care of everything." The ugly truth was spilling out in front of 40 witnesses. They weren't star-crossed lovers torn apart by circumstances. They were two greedy people who'd planned to steal my life and got caught. "She froze the accounts," Thomas said, reading more of the legal papers. "Everything's frozen pending the divorce proceedings. We cannot access anything." Jessica stood up so fast her chair toppled backward. "Cannot access anything? What about the apartment? What about my car payment? What about—" She stopped mid-sentence, the full reality hitting her at once. Without access to Thomas's money, my money that he'd been stealing, she had nothing. Her lifestyle, her security, her future with him, all of it depended on funds that no longer existed. The look she gave Thomas in that moment was pure hatred. "You destroyed everything," she said, her voice cold as winter. "You absolute fool." And then she walked out. Just like that. No goodbye, no attempt to work through the crisis together, no declaration of love that would survive financial hardship. She grabbed her purse and left Thomas standing there alone with the wreckage of his choices. The silence that followed was deafening. 40 people stared at my husband as he stood among the scattered papers of his destruction, finally understanding that the quiet, dependable wife he'd underestimated had just checkmated him with his own moves. Michael's voice cut through the silence, quiet but carrying clearly across the room. "Dad, how could you do this to Mom?" But Thomas had no answer. He was still staring at the legal papers, still trying to process that the woman he dismissed as weak and stupid had just destroyed him so completely that even his mistress had abandoned him. That's when he started screaming my name. "Helen, Helen!" Thomas's voice cracked as he shouted my name across the parking lot. "Get back here. We need to talk." I stopped walking and turned around slowly, taking my time. Through the reception hall's floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the chaos inside. Overturned chairs, scattered papers, family members huddled in shocked conversations, and my husband standing in the middle of it all, like a man whose house was burning down around him. When I walked back through those doors, the entire room fell silent. 40 pairs of eyes followed my movements as I made my way calmly to our table, where Thomas stood surrounded by the evidence of his betrayal. "You wanted to talk?" I said, my voice carrying clearly in the hushed room. "Let's talk." Thomas's face was red and blotchy, his perfect hair disheveled from running his hands through it. The confident man who'd made his announcement 20 minutes earlier was gone, replaced by someone desperate and panicked. "You cannot do this," he said, his voice shaking. "Not like this, not in front of everyone." I looked around the room at our family and friends, people who'd known us for decades, who'd celebrated our anniversary parties and holiday dinners, who'd believed we had a solid, loving marriage. "You chose the venue," I said simply. "I thought you wanted everyone to witness your big announcement." Michael approached our table, his face pale but determined. "Mom, what's going on? Dad's saying you filed for divorce." I nodded, reaching into my purse for the folder I'd prepared for this moment. "I filed this morning, honey. I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but your father made that choice when he decided to destroy our marriage at your wedding dinner." "This is insane," Thomas said, grabbing my arm. "You're being vindictive. You're trying to ruin me over some midlife crisis." I looked down at his hand on my arm, then back up at his face. "Remove your hand," I said quietly. "Now." Something in my tone made him let go immediately. Midlife crisis. I opened my folder and pulled out the bank statements. "Is that what you call stealing $40,000 from our retirement account to fund your affair?" A gasp rippled through the room. My sister Margaret stepped closer, her eyes wide as she looked at the papers in my hands. "You've been tracking our accounts." Thomas's voice was getting higher, more desperate. "That's invasion of privacy. That's my job," I interrupted. "I work at a credit union, remember? Tracking financial irregularities is literally what I do for a living." Rachel Martinez chose that moment to walk through the reception hall doors. I'd asked her to come knowing I might need legal backup for this conversation. "Mrs. Johnson," Rachel said, approaching our table with professional calm. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Perfect timing," I said. "Rachel, this is my husband, Thomas. Thomas, this is Rachel Martinez, my attorney." The color drained from Thomas's face again. "Attorney, you hired an attorney without telling me. The same way you open secret bank accounts without telling me," I replied. "Rachel, would you mind explaining to my husband what happens when someone violates the adultery clause in their prenuptial agreement?" Rachel smiled not warmly, but with professional satisfaction. "Certainly, Mr. Johnson. When you signed your prenuptial agreement 32 years ago, you included a fidelity provision that voids most asset protections in the event of adultery. Your wife has documented evidence of your affair, including financial records showing you used marital assets to support another woman." "That cannot be legal," Thomas said. But his voice had lost all its fight. "It's completely legal," Rachel continued. "In fact, it's exactly what you designed it to be. The prenup was your idea, your language, your protection. You just never imagined it would be used against you." Michael was reading over the bank statements, now his expression growing darker with each line. "Dad, you stole from Mom's retirement account. You used her money to pay for your affair." "It's not theft," Thomas said weakly. "It's marital property. I had every right." "You had every right to use our joint funds to buy jewelry for another woman." I kept my voice level, devoid of the anger I'd been carrying for months. "You had every right to pay for weekend trips I knew nothing about, to put a down payment on an apartment for your secretary." The room was so quiet you could hear people breathing. Uncle James was shaking his head in disgust. Sarah's parents looked mortified to be witnessing this family implosion. "Where's Jessica now?" I asked, looking around the room. "Your partner in this grand romance, the woman who is going to make you so much happier than I ever could." Thomas's silence was answer enough. "She left," Michael said quietly. "The minute she realized the money was gone, she walked out." I nodded. "That tells you everything you need to know about what your relationship was really built on." "Helen, please," Thomas said, and for the first time his voice held genuine desperation rather than anger. "We can work this out. We can go to counseling." I looked at this man I'd been married to for 32 years, this stranger who'd systematically betrayed and stolen from me while I slept beside him every night and felt nothing but cold certainty. "You're right about one thing," I said. "You did make a mistake. You assumed I was too weak, too stupid, and too dependent to fight back. You assumed wrong." I gathered my papers and put them back in my folder. The accounts are frozen until the divorce is finalized. You'll be hearing from my attorney about the asset division and the theft charges we're considering filing." As I turned to leave, Thomas made one last desperate attempt. "You cannot take everything. I built that business. I earned that money." I stopped and looked back at him one final time. "With my credit, my unpaid labor, and my financial support," I said. "And now you're going to learn exactly what that was worth." Walking out of that reception hall for the second time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete and total control over my own life. Behind me, I could hear Thomas still trying to explain himself to our son, still trying to minimize what he'd done, still trying to play the victim. But nobody was listening anymore. I drove home in silence, the weight of 32 years lifting from my shoulders with each mile. When I pulled into our driveway, I sat in the car for a long moment, looking at the house we'd shared for so long. It didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a museum of a life I'd outgrown. Inside, I kicked off my heels and poured myself a glass of the expensive wine Thomas kept for special occasions. I took my drink out to the back porch and sat in the gathering twilight, listening to the cicadas sing in the trees. For the first time in decades, I didn't have to worry about making dinner for anyone. I didn't have to wait up for a husband who might or might not come home. I didn't have to pretend I believed his lies. I was free. My phone rang the display, showing Michael's name. I hesitated before answering, unsure of what my son would say after witnessing the public execution of his parents' marriage. "Mom?" His voice sounded tired, drained. "Are you okay?" "I'm okay, sweetie," I said, surprised to find it was true. "I'm so sorry about your wedding. This isn't how I wanted things to happen." "Don't apologize," Michael said firmly. "Dad's the one who chose to do this today. I can't believe he's been stealing from you, cheating on you. How long have you known?" "A few months," I admitted. "I didn't want to tell you before the wedding. I didn't want to ruin your happiness." "But he was planning to announce it at the reception all along," Michael said, the anger clear in his voice. "That's why he insisted on paying for it. That's why he invited Jessica. He was going to humiliate you in front of everyone." "Yes," I said simply, "that was the plan." "But you knew," Michael said, a note of admiration creeping into his voice. "You were ready for him." I smiled into the phone. "I've learned a few things in 30 years at the credit union. Following money trails is what I do." "Sarah and I are coming over," Michael said suddenly. "We'll stay with you tonight." "No, honey," I said firmly. "It's your wedding night. Go be with your wife. I'm perfectly fine." "Are you sure I don't want you to be alone?" "I've been alone in my marriage for years, Michael," I said softly. "Being physically alone in this house is actually a relief. Go enjoy your first night as husband and wife. We'll talk tomorrow." After we hung up, I sat for a long time in the gathering darkness, thinking about the future. For so long, my life had revolved around Thomas and Michael, around their needs and their dreams. Now Michael was grown married, starting his own life, and Thomas had made his choice. For the first time in over 3 decades, I could make choices based solely on what I wanted. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. That night, I slept in the guest bedroom. I couldn't bear to sleep in the bed I'd shared with Thomas, knowing what I knew. In the morning, I woke early, made coffee, and started making lists: financial accounts to separate, assets to document, professional contacts to reach out to. It was strange how calm I felt, how methodical. There were no tears, no breakdowns, no moments of doubt, just a steady determination to rebuild my life on my own terms. Rachel called around noon. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice warm with concern. "Surprisingly well," I answered, looking down at the pages of notes I'd made. "I've been making plans." "That's good," Rachel said, "because Thomas just called my office. He's hired Gregory Reynolds as his attorney." My stomach tightened. Gregory Reynolds was known as one of the most aggressive divorce attorneys in the state, a man who specialized in helping wealthy clients hide assets and minimize settlements. "Does that change anything?" I asked, trying to keep the worry from my voice. "Not really," Rachel assured me. "Reynolds might be aggressive, but we have the law and the evidence on our side. The adultery clause in your prenup is ironclad, and we have concrete proof that Thomas used marital funds to support his affair. Reynolds can bluster all he wants, but he can't change those facts. Thomas will try to hide assets," I said, thinking about how thorough my husband had been in concealing his affair. "Let him try," Rachel said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. With your background in finance and my experience with high-asset divorces, we'll find whatever he tries to hide. In fact, any attempt to conceal assets will only make things worse for him when the judge finds out. After we hung up, I walked through the house, really seeing it for the first time in years. The furniture Thomas had insisted on buying, even though it wasn't my style. The beige walls he'd refused to let me repaint. The outdated kitchen he'd always promised to renovate but never did. None of it felt like me. It was the shell of a life I'd been pretending to live, a compromise that had long since stopped working. I realized with sudden clarity that I didn't want to keep this house in the divorce. I wanted to start fresh in a space that was entirely my own. I spent the next week in a strange limbo. Thomas didn't come home, which was a relief. According to Michael, he was staying at a hotel downtown. Jessica had apparently moved on quickly, already seen around town with a cardiologist from the hospital. The speed of her betrayal confirmed everything I'd suspected about their relationship. It had never been about love. It had always been about money and status. Thomas made one attempt to contact me directly, calling late one evening when I was reviewing financial documents at the kitchen table. "Helen," his voice sounded rough, desperate. "We need to talk. This has gotten out of hand." "I have nothing to say to you, Thomas," I replied calmly. "Any communication should go through our attorneys." "Please," he said, and I was surprised to hear what sounded like genuine emotion in his voice. 32 years of marriage deserves more than this. We need to sit down face to face and discuss this like adults. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of the old connection, the habit of responding to his needs. Then I remembered the look on his face as he announced our marriage was over in front of our son, the smug satisfaction as he'd planned my public humiliation. The tenderness vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "You chose how this would end," I said, my voice cool and distant. "You chose to betray me, to steal from me, to plan my humiliation at our son's wedding. Those were your choices, Thomas. Now you get to live with the consequences." I hung up before he could respond, my hand steady, my resolve unshaken. There would be no tearful reconciliations, no weakness that he could exploit. That chapter of my life was closed forever. 3 days later, I received a call from an unexpected source. Sarah, Michael's new wife, wanted to meet for coffee. We'd always had a good relationship, but we weren't particularly close. I was curious about what she wanted to discuss. We met at a small cafe downtown away from the neighborhood where most of our friends and family frequented. Sarah was already there when I arrived, a pretty young woman with intelligent eyes and a kind smile. She stood to hug me tightly when I approached the table. "Helen, thank you for meeting me," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "I know things have been chaotic since the wedding." "That's putting it mildly," I said with a small smile. "How are you and Michael doing? I've been so worried that all this drama has overshadowed your first weeks of marriage." "We're okay," Sarah assured me. "Michael is still processing everything, but he's mainly concerned about you." "I'm fine," I said automatically, the response I'd been giving everyone who asked. Sarah gave me a knowing look. "Are you really? Because nobody would be fine after what you've been through?" The directness of her question caught me off guard. For so long I'd been holding myself together, presenting a strong, composed exterior to the world. But something about Sarah's genuine concern made the cracks in my armor visible. I hesitated, searching for the right words. "I'm functioning. I'm moving forward. Some days are harder than others." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I can't imagine how betrayed you must feel, but I want you to know that Michael and I are here for you, whatever you need." "Thank you," I said, blinking back unexpected tears. "That means a lot to me." "Actually," Sarah continued, "that's part of why I wanted to meet with you. I have a proposal." She pulled a folder from her bag and slid it across the table to me. Inside was a business plan for a small catering company, complete with financial projections, marketing strategies, and equipment lists. "Michael told me about your dream," Sarah explained, "how you used to run Helen's Delights before you gave it up to support Thomas's career. He said your peach cobbler was legendary." I stared at the papers in disbelief. "You did all this?" Sarah nodded. "I majored in business administration before going to culinary school. This is what I do. And Michael and I both think that once your divorce is settled, this could be the perfect fresh start for you." "I'm 58 years old," I said, voicing the doubt that had been haunting me. "Isn't it too late to start over?" "Are you kidding?" Sarah's eyes widened. "You have 30 years of life experience, professional financial skills, and culinary talent. Most importantly, you have a story that will resonate with people. The woman who reclaimed her dream after 30 years. That's not just a business plan, Helen. That's a brand." For the first time since discovering Thomas's betrayal, I felt a genuine spark of excitement. Not just the cold satisfaction of revenge, but the warm glow of possibility. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, flipping through the meticulously prepared business plan. "This is incredibly thoughtful." "You don't have to decide anything now," Sarah said. "Just think about it. Michael and I believe in you, and we want to help in any way we can." As I drove home from the cafe, my mind was racing with possibilities. The business plan Sarah had prepared was sound, conservative in its projections, but ambitious in its vision. With my settlement from the divorce, I would have the capital to launch without taking on debt. And after decades of managing other people's finances, I certainly had the skills to run a business. But more than the practical considerations, it was the emotional resonance of returning to my original passion that called to me. Cooking had always been my true love, the thing that made me feel most alive. The thought of building a business around that passion of creating something that was entirely mine filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. When I got home, I went straight to the attic and dug out the boxes I'd packed away 3 decades ago. My grandmother's handwritten recipes, yellowed with age but still legible. The specialized tools I couldn't bear to sell when we moved. Photos of my first catering events back when I was just starting out. Holding these artifacts of my former life, I felt like I was rediscovering pieces of myself that had been lost for years. The young woman with dreams and ambitions who believed she could create something meaningful through her passion for food. She wasn't gone. She had just been waiting for the right moment to emerge again. That night I sat at my kitchen table and began to write. Not legal strategies or financial analyses, but recipes. My grandmother's peach cobbler, my spiced cornbread, the macaroni and cheese that had once made a food critic from the local paper weep with joy. As my pen moved across the page, I felt myself coming alive again, reconnecting with the person I used to be before I subordinated my dreams to Thomas's ambitions. For the first time since discovering his betrayal, I found myself almost grateful to Thomas. If he hadn't pushed me to this breaking point, I might have spent the rest of my life in comfortable complacency, never reclaiming the passion that once defined me. His betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been liberating. It had forced me to reimagine my life on my own terms. As I wrote recipe after recipe, the outline of my future began to take shape. Not just a business, but a new identity. Not just financial independence, but creative fulfillment. Not just surviving Thomas's betrayal, but thriving despite it. I was no longer just Thomas Johnson's soon-to-be ex-wife. I was Helen Wilson, soon-to-be founder and owner of Second Chances Catering. And for the first time in decades, I couldn't wait to see what the future held. 6 months later, on what would have been our 33rd anniversary, I stood in the kitchen of my new catering business, Second Chances, preparing my grandmother's famous peach cobbler for a client's golden anniversary party. The irony wasn't lost on me, celebrating 50 years of genuine love, while my own marriage had crumbled after 32 years of lies. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks earlier, and the results were even better than Rachel had predicted. The adultery clause in Thomas's precious prenuptial agreement had worked exactly as written, voiding every protection he'd thought he'd secured. I kept the house, 75% of our investments, the retirement accounts he'd tried to steal from, and received spousal support for the next 5 years. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was watching the dominoes of Thomas's carefully constructed deception fall one by one. Jessica had lasted exactly 2 weeks after the wedding disaster. Once she realized that Thomas's money was gone and wouldn't be coming back, she cleaned out their secret apartment and moved in with another man before the month ended. Word through mutual acquaintances was that her new boyfriend was a cardiologist with a much larger bank account and no inconvenient wives to complicate things. Thomas had tried to fight the divorce at first, hiring Gregory Reynolds, an expensive attorney who'd taken one look at the prenuptial agreement and advised him to settle quickly. The bank statements showing systematic theft, the photographs of him with Jessica, and the paper trail of lies had made his case impossible to defend. The business he'd been so proud of was struggling now. Without my unpaid bookkeeping and financial management, and with his reputation in tatters after word spread about the affair and the theft, clients had started looking elsewhere for their insurance needs. He'd been forced to sell his share to his business partner just to pay his legal fees. The potential fraud charges Rachel had mentioned never materialized. I decided that destroying his life was enough without sending him to prison. Sometimes mercy looks like letting someone face the natural consequences of their choices without adding extra punishment. Michael had struggled with the revelation about his father, but he'd made his position clear the week after the wedding. "Mom," he'd said, sitting in my kitchen while I made him his favorite chocolate chip cookies. "I'm sorry I didn't see what he was doing to you. I'm sorry it took so long for someone to stand up for you." "You were never supposed to protect me," I told him. "That was never your job." My son had inherited my sense of justice and his father's stubborn streak, but he directed it in the right direction. He'd cut contact with Thomas entirely after learning about the stolen retirement money, saying he couldn't respect a man who'd steal from his own wife. Sarah, my new daughter-in-law, had become one of my closest allies. She had helped me design a logo for my catering business and had been my first official client hiring me to cater her law firm's holiday party. Word of mouth from that event had led to 3 more bookings, then 5, then 10. The catering business was everything I dreamed it would be 30 years ago and more. I specialized in Southern comfort food with elegant presentation, the kind of cooking that made people feel loved and celebrated. My peach cobbler had become legendary among my clients. My mac and cheese was booked solid through the spring. I'd even started offering cooking classes on weekends for people who wanted to learn my techniques. But the best part wasn't the success or the money or even the satisfaction of building something with my own hands. The best part was waking up every morning knowing that every choice I made was mine, every dollar I earned was mine, and every dream I pursued belonged to me alone. I'd learned something profound about myself in those months of planning my revenge. Patience and intelligence will always defeat impulse and emotion. Thomas had acted from greed and selfishness, making decisions based on what he wanted in the moment. I'd acted from strategy and self-respect, building a plan that would protect my future rather than just satisfy my anger. The difference between us was that he'd seen our marriage as something to escape from, while I'd seen it as something worth fighting for until the moment he proved it wasn't worth saving. 3 weeks ago, I'd received a phone call from Thomas. He was living in a studio apartment across town, working for someone else's insurance agency, and apparently feeling sorry for himself. "Helen," he'd said, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I made terrible mistakes. I know I cannot undo what I did, but maybe we could talk. Maybe there's some way to fix this." I'd listened to his entire speech, his apologies, his excuses, his promises that he'd changed. When he finished, I'd said only one thing. "I hope you find happiness, Thomas, but you will not find it with me." That was the last conversation we'd ever had, and I intended to keep it that way. Now, putting the finishing touches on my client's anniversary dessert, I reflected on how much my life had changed. I owned a successful business, lived in a beautiful home that was entirely mine, and woke up every day excited about the possibilities ahead of me. I had my son's love and respect, genuine friendships with people who valued me for who I was, and dreams that belonged to nobody but me. The bell above the shop door chimed, pulling me from my thoughts. I looked up to see Rachel walking in her briefcase in one hand and a bottle of champagne in the other. "I thought we should celebrate properly," she said, holding up the bottle with a smile. "Final divorce papers were officially recorded yesterday. You are now, in every legal sense, completely free of Thomas Johnson." I laughed and set down my rolling pin. "You brought Dom Perignon to my kitchen. That's a bit fancy for a woman who spends her days elbow-deep in pie crust." "Nothing's too fancy for the woman who executed the most satisfying divorce strategy I've seen in 20 years of practice," Rachel replied, setting the bottle on the counter. "Besides, this isn't just about the divorce. It's about everything you've built in the last 6 months. Second Chances is becoming one of the most talked-about catering services in the city." She wasn't exaggerating. What had started as a small operation run out of my renovated kitchen had quickly grown into a legitimate business with 3 part-time employees and bookings scheduled months in advance. The feature in the local lifestyle magazine last month had brought in a flood of new clients, many of them women my age, who connected with my story of reinvention after divorce. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," I said, opening a drawer to look for champagne glasses. "That's not true," Rachel countered, taking off her suit jacket and hanging it carefully on a hook by the door. "You had everything you needed inside you all along. The business skills, the culinary talent, the courage. All I did was show you that the legal system could work in your favor for once." As we sipped champagne in my flour-dusted kitchen, I thought about the strange, winding path that had brought me here. If Thomas hadn't betrayed me, I might never have found the courage to restart my catering business. If he hadn't tried to humiliate me at Michael's wedding, I might never have discovered just how strong I really was. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd caught Thomas earlier?" Rachel asked, seemingly reading my thoughts. Before he'd taken so much money before Jessica, I considered the question carefully. I think it would have played out the same way, just with different details. Thomas didn't suddenly become unfaithful after 30 years of marriage. He just finally got caught. The man who could stand up at his son's wedding and publicly discard his wife of 32 years was always capable of that kind of cruelty. I just refused to see it. Rachel nodded slowly. "When did you first realize you weren't going to try to save your marriage?" Most of my clients struggle with that decision, even when the betrayal is as clear-cut as Thomas's was. "The moment I saw him wearing the blue tie," I said without hesitation. "The one I gave him for his birthday, the one he told me was too flashy. Seeing him wear it for her, watching him lie directly to my face about working late when I knew exactly where he'd been and who he'd been with, something just clicked. I realized I'd been making excuses for his behavior for decades, always putting his needs above my own, always believing his lies because the truth was too painful to face." "And now," Rachel asked, refilling our glasses, "how does it feel to be on the other side?" I looked around my kitchen at the space I'd designed exactly to my specifications. The commercial-grade ovens I'd installed myself, the marble countertops I'd chosen because they reminded me of my grandmother's kitchen, the herb garden growing in the window that filled the room with the scent of basil and rosemary. "It feels like coming home," I said simply, to myself. The next morning I woke early to prepare for a meeting with a potential new client. As I dressed, I caught sight of myself in the mirror and paused. The woman looking back at me was different from the one who had stood in this same spot a year ago, getting ready for another day of compromises and silent disappointments. My hair was different, for one thing. After the divorce was finalized, I'd gone to the salon and had my sensible shoulder-length bob transformed into a stylish pixie cut with subtle caramel highlights. Thomas had always insisted I keep my hair long, claiming short hair made women look old. But I'd discovered that the right cut actually took years off my appearance, emphasizing my cheekbones and bringing attention to my eyes. I wore different clothes now, too. Gone were the bland, inoffensive outfits Thomas preferred, replaced by clothes with color and texture and personality. Today I chose a cobalt blue dress with a fitted waist and a subtle pattern paired with comfortable but stylish ankle boots. The outfit was professional, but distinctly me in a way my old wardrobe never had been. But the most significant change wasn't in my appearance. It was in my eyes. The woman in the mirror looked back at me with confidence, with purpose, with a quiet joy that came from living authentically. There was no more fear, no more constant need for approval, no more walking on eggshells to avoid upsetting someone else's fragile ego. I was no longer Thomas Johnson's wife. I was Helen Wilson, fully and completely myself for the first time in decades. My meeting was with a wealthy couple celebrating their 25th wedding anniversary. They wanted an intimate dinner party for 20 of their closest friends, featuring elevated versions of dishes from the early years of their relationship. It was exactly the kind of event I love to cater, personal and meaningful, with plenty of room for creative interpretation. As I drove to their home in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods, I couldn't help but compare their marriage to what mine had been. Would they make it to 32 years? Would they still look at each other with genuine affection, or would they too be hiding secrets and resentments behind closed doors? The house was a stunning modern structure, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a perfectly manicured garden. I was greeted at the door by Catherine Reynolds, a woman about my age with a warm smile and an elegant manner. "You must be Helen," she said, extending her hand. "I've heard wonderful things about your food. Please come in." I followed her through the house to a spacious kitchen that would have made a professional chef jealous. Her husband David joined us, kissing his wife's cheek before shaking my hand. "Catherine's been talking about your peach cobbler for weeks," he said with a genuine smile. "Apparently it's life-changing." "I make no such promises," I laughed. "But it is my grandmother's recipe, and she was something of a culinary genius." As we sat at their kitchen island discussing menu options, I was struck by the easy affection between them. The way David's hand rested lightly on Catherine's back, the way she leaned slightly toward him when he spoke, the shared glances that suggested inside jokes and private understandings. This was what a real partnership looked like. This was what I'd thought I had with Thomas, what I'd spent decades pretending we shared. "We want the evening to tell our story," Catherine explained, showing me photographs from their early days together. Our first date was at a little Italian place in Boston that served the most amazing risotto. Our first vacation together was in New Orleans, where we fell in love with jambalaya and beignets. And somehow we need to incorporate hot dogs, David added with a mischievous grin. We were broke college students when we met, and most of our dates involved hot dogs from this cart outside the library. Catherine rolled her eyes affectionately. David insists on including this detail in our love story, even though those hot dogs were absolutely terrible. But memorable, he countered, squeezing her hand. Isn't that what matters? The way they laughed together made my heart ache, not with jealousy exactly, but with the recognition of what had been missing from my own marriage. Thomas and I hadn't shared moments like this in years, maybe ever. We'd existed alongside each other, fulfilling our designated roles, but we hadn't truly seen each other, hadn't delighted in each other's quirks and stories. As I drove home from the meeting, a new menu plan taking shape in my mind, I wondered if I would ever experience that kind of connection. At 58, was it too late to find a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine affection? Did I even want to try again after everything I'd been through? The question followed me through the rest of the day as I tested recipes and placed orders for upcoming events. By evening, I'd settled into my favorite spot on the back porch with a glass of wine and my mother's old recipe journal, finding comfort in the familiar handwriting and the memories it evoked. The phone rang, breaking the peaceful silence. It was Michael. "Mom, are you sitting down?" he asked without preamble, his voice vibrating with excitement. "I am actually," I replied, setting my wine glass on the side table. "What's going on?" "Sarah's pregnant," he blurted out. "We just got the confirmation today. You're going to be a grandmother." The news hit me like a wave, joy and surprise, and a dozen other emotions washing over me at once. A grandmother. Me. The words seemed impossible magical. "Michael, that's wonderful," I said, my voice catching. "I'm so happy for both of you. How is Sarah feeling?" "She's good, a little tired, but good. We wanted you to be the first to know, well after her parents. We called them right before you." "When is the baby due?" I asked, my mind already racing ahead to nursery colors and tiny outfits. "September," Michael replied, "just after our first anniversary." After we hung up, I sat in the gathering dusk, tears slipping down my cheeks. Happy tears for the most part. Joy for Michael and Sarah, anticipation for this new life coming into the world. Gratitude that I would be here to witness it, to be part of it. But mixed with the happiness was a bittersweet realization. This child, this precious new life, would be born into a family already fractured by betrayal and divorce. My grandchild would never know what it was like to have grandparents who loved each other, who sat side by side at family gatherings, who shared holidays and birthdays as a united front. Instead, there would be separate visits, careful scheduling to avoid uncomfortable overlaps, the perpetual diplomatic challenge of including Thomas in family events without forcing me to interact with him more than absolutely necessary. It wasn't what I would have chosen for my grandchild for any of us. For the first time since discovering Thomas's betrayal, I allowed myself to grieve. Not for the loss of him, but for the loss of what our family could have been, should have been. I grieved for the dream that had died, the future we'd planned together that would never come to pass. The grief didn't last long. It couldn't not when there was so much to look forward to, so much to be grateful for. I wiped my tears and went inside to call Sarah to offer my congratulations and support directly to begin planning for this new chapter in all our lives. The next morning, I woke with a new sense of purpose. I would be the best grandmother any child could ask for. I would create traditions and memories that would last a lifetime. I would build a legacy of love and strength for this new generation. Starting with food, of course. I spent the day experimenting with baby food recipes, testing organic purees, and thinking about meals that would appeal to young palates while providing proper nutrition. I made lists of kitchen tools I would need, designed a special corner in my kitchen where a high chair could someday sit, imagined tiny hands learning to roll dough and stir batter under my watchful eye. In the midst of my planning frenzy, Rachel called to check on me. "I just heard from Michael about the baby," she said. "How are you feeling about becoming Grandma Helen?" "Excited, terrified, grateful, all of the above," I admitted. "I've been cooking all day, testing baby food recipes, even though the baby won't need solid food for at least a year." Rachel laughed. "Of course you have. That's your love language, feeding people. This kid is going to be the best-fed child in the state." "There's something else," I said, hesitating slightly. "I've been thinking about the scholarship idea we discussed. For women over 50 who want to start food businesses. I think I'm ready to move forward with it. Several months earlier, Rachel had suggested I consider creating a scholarship fund for women like me, women who'd put their dreams on hold for decades and needed financial support to start over. The idea had resonated with me immediately, but I'd been too busy getting second chances off the ground to give it serious thought. "That's wonderful," Rachel said. "What changed your mind?" "Michael's news," I explained. "I started thinking about legacy, about what I want to leave behind for my grandchild. And yes, I want to leave financial security and family recipes and happy memories, but I also want to leave an example of what it means to help others to turn your own hardship into something positive for someone else." "Helen Wilson changing the world one peach cobbler at a time," Rachel teased, but I could hear the pride in her voice. "Hardly changing the world," I demurred. "Just trying to make things a little easier for women like me." But as we discussed the logistics of setting up the scholarship, how to structure it, and where to find applicants, I felt a deep sense of rightness settle over me. This was the next step in my journey, the natural evolution of everything I'd been through, taking the pain of my past and transforming it into opportunity for others. 2 days later, I received an unexpected visitor at Second Chances. I was in the back kitchen up to my elbows in pie dough when Marjorie, my part-time assistant, appeared in the doorway. "There's someone here to see you," she said, her expression uncertain. "A Mr. Johnson. He says he's your ex-husband." My hands stilled in the dough. "Thomas, here in my sanctuary." My first instinct was to refuse to see him, to have Marjorie send him away. But something made me reconsider. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was the confidence that came from knowing he no longer had any power over me. "Tell him I'll be out in 5 minutes," I said, wiping my hands on my apron. "I need to finish this first." I took my time completing the pie crust, refusing to rush because of Thomas's unexpected arrival. When I finally emerged from the kitchen, I found him standing awkwardly by the display case, examining the rows of pastries and desserts. He looked older, diminished somehow. The confident, commanding presence that had once filled our home was gone, replaced by a man who seemed unsure of his place in the world. He wore a suit that hung loosely on his frame, suggesting he'd lost weight. His hair had more gray than I remembered. "Hello, Thomas," I said calmly, removing my apron and hanging it on a hook by the kitchen door. "What brings you here?" He turned at the sound of my voice, his eyes widening slightly as he took in my appearance. I realized this was the first time he'd seen me since the divorce was finalized, the first time he was seeing the new Helen rather than the woman he'd left behind. "Helen," he said, his voice catching, "you look well, really well." "Thank you," I replied, neither cold nor warm. "You wanted to speak with me." Thomas glanced around the busy shop at the customers enjoying their coffee and pastries, at the staff moving efficiently behind the counter. "Could we sit somewhere and talk privately?" I considered refusing, but curiosity won out. I led him to a small office at the back of the shop, leaving the door open as a precaution. I didn't fear Thomas anymore, but I had no desire to be alone with him either. "Michael told me about the baby," Thomas said once we were seated. "I'm going to be a grandfather." "Yes," I said simply. "He also told me you're doing well. The business is successful." Thomas gestured vaguely at the shop beyond the office door. "I can see that for myself now." I waited, saying nothing. Whatever Thomas had come to say, I wouldn't make it easier for him by filling the silence. "I made a terrible mistake, Helen," he said finally, his voice low and urgent. "The biggest mistake of my life, leaving you for Jessica. It was insanity, temporary insanity." "Was it," I asked, raising an eyebrow, "or was it just the culmination of years of entitlement and selfishness?" Thomas flinched at my directness. "I deserve that," he admitted. "I deserve all of it. But I want you to know that I regret what I did. Every day I regret it." "What exactly do you regret Thomas cheating on me, stealing from our retirement accounts, humiliating me at our son's wedding, or just getting caught?" He had the grace to look ashamed. "All of it. I regret hurting you. I regret destroying our family. I regret throwing away 32 years for nothing." I studied him carefully, looking for signs of manipulation or deceit. But all I saw was genuine remorse, the desperate regret of a man who'd realized too late what he'd lost. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "What do you want from me, Thomas?" He met my gaze directly for the first time. "Forgiveness," he said simply. "Not reconciliation. I know that's impossible now. Just forgiveness. I don't want our grandchild to grow up in a family divided by bitterness. I don't want Michael to have to choose between his parents for the rest of his life." The request surprised me. I'd expected Thomas to ask for another chance to suggest we try again now that Jessica was out of the picture. Forgiveness was both less and more than I'd anticipated. "Forgiveness isn't something I can just give you because you ask for it," I said after a long moment. "It's a process, one I'm working through in my own time and my own way." "I understand." Thomas nodded, disappointment evident in his face. "I shouldn't have come. I'm sorry for disturbing you at work." As he stood to leave, I found myself saying something unexpected. "Have you had lunch?" Thomas looked confused. No. We have a special today. Chicken pot pie with a rosemary crust. My grandmother's recipe. You always liked it." The invitation surprised me as much as it seemed to surprise him. "I'd like that," he said cautiously, "if you're sure." I wasn't sure, not entirely. But as I led Thomas back to the main area of the shop and signaled to Marjorie to bring 2 lunch specials, I realized I was no longer angry. The rage that had fueled me through the divorce proceedings, the cold determination to make Thomas pay for his betrayal, had faded into something more like indifference. We ate in relative silence, making occasional small talk about the shop, about Michael and Sarah's news. Thomas complimented the food sincerely, his eyes lighting up with recognition at the familiar flavors of my grandmother's recipe. "You've created something amazing here, Helen," he said as he finished the last bite of pot pie. "I always knew you would if you ever got the chance." "Did you?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Then why did you work so hard to make sure I never got that chance?" The question hung between us, not accusatory, but direct. Thomas considered it carefully before answering. "I was afraid," he admitted finally, "afraid that if you had your own success, your own identity outside of our marriage, you wouldn't need me anymore, that you'd outgrow me. So I kept you small, kept you dependent. It was selfish and cowardly, and I'm deeply ashamed of it now." The honesty of his response caught me off guard. In all our years together, I couldn't remember Thomas ever being this vulnerable, this self-aware. "Thank you for saying that," I said quietly. "It helps hearing you acknowledge it." After Thomas left, promising to respect my boundaries, while hoping we could find a way to be civil for Michael and the baby's sake, I returned to my kitchen with a lighter heart than I'd expected. Seeing Thomas again had confirmed what I already knew: my life was infinitely better without him. But it had also shown me that I'd moved beyond the pain he'd caused, that I was ready to build a future unencumbered by bitterness or regret. That evening, as I closed up the shop and prepared to head home, I paused to look around the space I'd created. The warm lighting, the comfortable chairs, the display cases full of beautiful desserts. This was mine. Every inch of it, every recipe, every decision. Mine alone. Outside, the sky was painted in shades of pink and gold as the sun set behind the city skyline. I stood for a moment on the sidewalk, breathing in the evening air, feeling the pleasant fatigue of a day spent doing work I loved. A couple walked past, middle-aged like me, holding hands and laughing together about something private. I watched them go, feeling neither envy nor sadness, just a quiet appreciation for their evident happiness and a growing certainty about my own. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting free. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't destroying your enemy, but building a life so beautiful that their betrayal becomes the catalyst for your greatest happiness. Thomas had given me the greatest gift without intending to. He'd shown me my own strength, my own resilience, my own capacity for reinvention. In trying to destroy me, he had inadvertently set me free. As I walked to my car, I thought about the future stretching before me. A grandchild to love, a business to grow, a scholarship to establish, friends to cherish, maybe someday if the right person came along, even love to rediscover. But for now, for this moment, I was complete in myself, whole and healed and happy. The woman who'd walked out of that reception hall 6 months ago with her head held high had found her way to a life better than anything she could have imagined. Sometimes justice tastes like peach cobbler, smells like your own kitchen, and sounds like your own laughter, echoing through a home that finally belongs to you. Sometimes healing looks like a second chance at the dream you thought was lost forever. And sometimes the happy ending isn't the one you planned for, but the one you create for yourself out of the wreckage of what was. My name is Helen Wilson, and this is my story of betrayal and resurrection, of ending and beginning, of a wedding where something died and a new life was born from its ashes. This is the story of how I lost everything and found myself.